first story that I will tell today is the story of Kanji Mala. So Kanji Mala was a Kutchi sailor who was born in the shipbuilding town of Mandalay, right? And the ships that they built there are part of a long history of interaction between East Africa and India. And so it was only, I mean, it was no surprise that Kanji Mala became a sailor, and he plied these seaways between India and Africa for many years. Then finally in 1497, 1498, he would have an encounter that would change the course of pretty much the whole world. So what happened in 1497 was that he met a European sailor who was looking for the sea route to India. And since he had done this so many times, he agreed to show them the way. And so when he was at Malindi, he led this European sailor to Calicut. And this European sailor is Vasco da Gama. Now, I'm taking some creative liberties with the story because there is debate about whether Kanji Malam actually is the Malemo Kana who is mentioned in Vasco da Gama in the Portuguese sources, or if it was another Arab sailor called Ahmed ibn Majid. But regardless of whether it was either one of these two, the important point to remember is that when we tell the story like this, starting from the other side, from the side of the pilot who led Vasco da Gama to India, we start to have an understanding of the colonial narrative that we have been taught for so long. As a student in Bombay, we only learned that Vasco da Gama discovered the sea route to India. But when we tell it like this, it makes us sensitive to how even this colonial history is in some sense built on top of a pre-existing relationship between India and Africa that goes back many centuries. And this is something that we have explored more, in greater detail through the medium of plot in the book that I co-authored with Renu and Meera. So if you're interested, I would really encourage you to have a look at that. But so this is the first story that I wanted to tell about the discovery of India, but from the other side. The second story that I want to tell is one of a Franciscan friar called Miguel de Purificação and his Indian Negro, right? So Miguel de Purificação was a Franciscan friar who was born in India to Portuguese parents. And the thing was that at that time, there was a distinction being made even within white Portuguese in India between those who were born in the Kingdom of Portugal and those who were born in Goa or in the Estado da India. And so what Miguel de Purificação is trying to do is he's trying to make the argument that we need to be treated on a par with these other Portuguese born in the kingdom, right? And of course, he writes an entire treatise which he goes to Rome to present, right? And in this treatise, he meanders through many philosophical, theological, historical arguments. But the one that I found interesting is the one where he says that in order to tell that it is the difference between us Europeans or between us and them, you have to employ the medium of the senses, right? Which is by looking, you can tell that we are not them and they are not us, right? And so he takes with him a darky Indian, right? Who he in his text is referred to as an Indian Negro. I'll just go to the next slide because you can see Miguel de Purificação here, but we don't have an image of his Indian Negro, right? And the point was that he was making the argument that by looking, by observation, it is possible to tell the difference between us and them. And I think that this is a very uh, important argument because it's also very pervasive, that starts to spread, and one that is, I would say, employed even to this day in places like Brazil, where in order to be part of the affirmative action system, you have a panel who will look at you and decide whether you are, eligible or not. And also because if you look, and even a person like Gandhi was not immune to these logics, right? Which in the end are colonial logics, right? Because when he was arguing for the Indians in South Africa, like in his early career, one of the arguments he makes is that you can't treat us like them. You can't, you know, put us together with those black Africans. And I think that this is an important point to remember when we're talking about India-Africa relations. Right? I think it's also important to remember that in some sense, this argument also exists within India prior to the arrival of the colonial powers, in the sense of caste, right? And how it is possible to tell by looking. And I think this is important because it is important if we want to build on the India-Africa relationship. We have to also address the problems that hinder this. And I think these logics and these arguments are something that need to be addressed and probably have not been as yet, or have not been addressed sufficiently. The next story I want to tell is the story of Siddhi Mubarak Bombay. So now we have arrived in a time where uh, slavery has been abolished in the Indian Ocean, but still it continues where, certain particularly Arab traders are engaging in slave trade. And so the British ships are intercepting these dhows, and however else they're being transported, but usually dhows. And instead of transporting these African uh, back to East Africa or back to the African continent, they bring them to the Bombay Presidency, and these start to be referred to as the Bombay Africans. And also the British authorities encourage the people in East Africa to use these Bombay Africans as guides, because they are familiar with the territory, and also because by then they have uh, learned some of the language and are able to communicate with both the British, and if they have coolies or other people supporting them in Hindi. So one of the early Bombay Africans is someone called Siddhi Mubarak Bombay. Right? This is a photograph from the Royal Geographical Society. And Siddhi Mubarak Bombay was born in the Yao Kingdom, which is on the border of Tanzania and Mozambique. And early in his life, he was captured by Arab slave traders, and he landed up in Gujarat, where he worked and he learned some Hindi, probably also some Gujarati, and I think also English. Now, when his master died, he became free, and he landed up back in Zanzibar, where he worked in the Sultan's army. And finally, he ended up being a guide for John Hanning Speke, who was looking for the source of the Nile. And he was found to be very useful because he could communicate with the explorers in both English and Hindustani. And so having a guide like this who was also familiar with space was very useful. Now, I think that this is important because, as we will see probably, in the next session, that there was already people of African descent on the Indian subcontinent, the Siddhis, right? But here we also have the example of someone going the other way as well. So you come to India and go back the other way, right? So this back and forth is something that I want to emphasize through this story. The third story is about Sita Valles, who is a Goan who was born in Luanda in Angola. and she went to medical college there, and she was very active in the liberation movement. Um, and finally, after the end of the Estado Novo in Portugal, she spent some time in Lisbon as well. So she was a medical student in Angola, and then she spent some time and she helped organize students there. And yeah, so she fought for the liberation of Angola alongside the Angolans, and I think this is important because along with the tensions, you also have a lot of solidarity that we see in stories like this, and this is just one example of many. People of Indian descent who had made Africa their home, and then who also became part of the freedom struggles within these countries. Now, another reason why I selected this story is because soon after Angola became independent, right, the government of Neto had Sita and some of uh, her comrades killed, right, and because they were thought of as being traitors, because Neto wanted to be part of to be non-aligned, right? The whereas, and because this was also the time of the Cold War, but she and her colleagues wanted to be sort of tied with the USSR. And I think uh, this is important because finally it shows that the relationship of India and Africa doesn't exist in a vacuum, in the sense that there are all of these other forces that the, the first thing that colonialism does is that it places India-Africa relations within the colonial network, and then even later with the Cold War, and even today, we have to always think of it as being part of a whole lot of other competing forces that also shape India-Africa relations, because we have to not think about colonialism as something that is over and done with, but that there is still networks and influences that shape these relationships, and it is important that we build this solidarity, that the global south is not something unique that exists because it exists in itself, but because it is something that we build together in order to combat this these historical and persisting forces of colonialism.